right, it is now my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Peter Balash. He's the Associate Director for Systems Analysis at the Department of Energy's NETL, National Energy Technology Laboratory. We're very lucky to have NETL right in our backyard. So Peter, stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Granger. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on campus, as always. I'm just going to give a few brief remarks on NETL and its interaction with grid-related questions. If you're not that familiar with the National Lab System, there's 17 of us. There's the multi-purpose science labs, which tend to be very large, Argonne, Oak Ridge, PNNL, the director's here today, I believe, and Berkeley Lab. There's multi-purpose security labs that have some aspect of the nuclear arms program with them, Lawrence, Livermore, Los Alamos, and Sandia. And then down on the lower left are the single-purpose science labs like Fermilab and SLAC. And then there's us, the energy technology labs, with Idaho Lab, National Lab. The lab formerly known as NREL is now known as the National Laboratory of the Rockies, or NLR. And here in Pittsburgh and Morgantown, the National Energy Technology Lab. So we're also called an applied lab, so the word technology is inserted into our description. We are federally operated, meaning I'm a federal employee. As opposed to all the other labs, the operations are run by contractors under contract to the Department of Energy. The primary sponsoring office of our research component in our program implementation was known as Fossil Energy and Carbon Management under the previous administration, Fossil Energy before that, and now has been rechristened Hydrocarbons and Geothermal Energy Office. So the offices of coal, oil, and gas are back, and the office this office is now incorporating the Geothermal Energy Office, which formerly was in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, which itself is now known as the Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation Office of DOE. So with that, I'll have a quiz later. We do two primary activities at NETL. We have our on-site, or sometimes called in-house, research and development, where scientists and engineers work on projects awarded by the sponsoring office, HEEO, and or other offices. And we are a large field office where we execute the DOE program. Essentially, half of that would be HGEO, and the balance would be for the Office of Electricity and for various programs in CMEI. I would say that, before I get to that, some of you may have heard of the reorganization that DOE, alluding to, has had as a mirror a reorganization of NETL on-site campuses. So we are located about 10 miles southeast of here, down PA 51, across the river. We actually started in conjunction with Carnegie Institute in 1910. The Morgantown office started in the 40s, and both of which in its early existence were there to, well, the Pittsburgh office was initially mine safety and then became, as with Morgantown, research trying to replace oil with coal through various technical processes during World War II. Then it became pollution management and control, as well as fuels. Albany, Oregon was a Interior Bureau mine site founded not far from the large dams in the Pacific Northwest, and its mission was to use abundant electricity to do novel things. So it has our metal bending people, advanced alloys, and The Albany, Oregon site will be the center for the Critical Minerals Center of Excellence. Pittsburgh will be the Center of Excellence for oil and gas, and Morgantown is the Center of Excellence for coal. There are numerous goals for DOE, HEO office, some that have a somewhat direct tie to the grid, and the rest are second or third removed. But modernizing and extending the life of existing coal assets is a goal of the Department of Energy. Optimizing efficiencies across the coal value chain as well. And the third primary goal of the Office of Coal is supporting the growth of coal-based power exports and manufacturing. With respect to hydrocarbons, it's production. It's improving the recovery factor through enhanced recovery, which would include CO2 EOR, to get more oil and gas out of the ground. And that could actually extend to enhanced geothermal recovery methods. Trying to come up with making new plays more viable is the second last goal. And there is a goal that is directly related to grid assurance, which is the midstream of the gas sector. So the gas pipelines, the energy storage, gas storage, natural gas storage, its sufficiency in light of the tremendous growth in natural gas generation and in projected growth for natural gas exports in the form of liquefied natural gas is putting a strain on the midstream, and making that more efficient and reliable is a goal of the US DOE. The systems office that I run has looked at a number of grid and generation related, I have to look at this, topics. So these pie charts look at Winter Storm Fern in Texas, in ERCOT, and looks at I don't know if you can hear me, energy generation in the 3 weeks before the storm, generation in the week of the storm, and what the generation mix looked like on the day of minimum wind and solar contribution. So before the storm, wind and solar at more or less expected capacity factors in ERCOT, 17% for solar and 34% for wind. That dipped to 15% for solar and 29% for wind during the week of the storm. All of that was made up by natural gas and coal. On the day that the load factor on wind and solar was at its minimum, coal capacity factor was 80%, natural gas 60%, and natural gas and coal provided 73% of the generation mix in Texas. Looking at peak demand day, which was January 26th, it's a similar story. Solar, in peak demand, solar did better than it did on its minimum day, a 23% capacity factor, 19% for wind. At the peak demand hour, a very similar story. Solar and wind about 37% as opposed to 51% during the week before, and with the dispatchable generation being fossil-based, making up the difference. That's the kind of story that underpins the administration's goal to keep the coal fleet from further retirements anytime soon. They are looking at keeping the existing fleet operable through the 2030s, and then new generation provided by nuclear and natural gas after that. So with these extreme events or weather events that, while extreme, are fairly regular, especially in a place like Texas or here in PJM, questions of the dispatchability come up, and what does that mean? Because models tend to adopt an average capacity factor of the machines on the grid. And so the prime movers that we would look at would be coal thermal plants, natural gas combined cycle plants, and combustion turbines. And I'm not going to get real deep into this, but what we do, the green is the coal and the blue is the natural gas combined cycle, and the orange is the combustion turbines. Models such as ProMod or Plexos or anybody else's dispatch model will assume an average factor for the entire country for these machines, which will not hold up across regions. And all our investigation has uncovered to date is that the last 3 years we see the ramp factors decreasing across these prime movers, which means that it overstates their flexibility. So there's room to improve the operation of units. In the case of coal, were invented to operate at base load instead to operate more flexibly. And what does that mean for the machines? How can you operate them at differential pressures? And so the economic analysis sets up analysis for process optimization, which is done at on the basis of mixed integer nonlinear models. And then lastly, there was an executive order last month from the White House that called for defense installations of the Department of War, also known as Department of Defense, to procure through power purchasing agreements capacity from existing coal plants for the base or for the shipyard or for whatever installation that the Department of Defense has. We are embarking on looking at what that means, if anything, for grid reliability in the areas that have these agreements. What does it imply for the viability of the coal plant that's consummating the contract with the Defense Department, and so on. There's quite a bit that we could talk about. With respect to systems analysis, we looked mainly at system cost of alternative energy systems, how to system costs with a reliability constraint. That reliability constraint can be an average, loss of load expectation, or it can be no loss of load and what that would mean for to build out a capacity on the system in order to assure that there is electrons flowing at all times in the United States, down to more component level analysis that scientists at the lab are capable of performing at looking at optical sensors and to detect perturbations in the grid and to help the grid self-heal. With that, I'll take questions about NETL or anything else.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think we have time for one question if anyone in the room has a question.
Here in front. Perfect.
Could you please go back to the slide on the change in the energy mix during the winter storm? Could you please explain, was that because wind or solar energy is particularly vulnerable to natural disasters, or what was the primary reason for the change in the mix in this case?
The pattern that's common in winter storms is the storm comes through, which might damage facilities. But then after the storm comes through, a high pressure system sits on top of the region, and that dampens the winds. And in the winter, there's not much solar to begin with. So it's a weather pattern that decreases wind velocities. That accounts for the drop-off. This was a better outcome for ERCOT than Uri 4 years earlier, in which things froze and generation was taken offline, which was a bigger problem and had worse effects.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter, for a wonderful keynote. And again, it's very lucky for us that NETL is so close to CMU, and thank you for your partnership over the decades. Please join me in giving Peter a round of applause.